Hi there. Here's the plan. Compost. I'm going to give you a little tiny slice of the science behind making compost. And then I'm going to tell you why, if you choose to, you can ignore most of it. I'm also going to show you the results of a little experiment we did with compost. What could possibly go wrong? I'm Mike, and this is the first dedicated gardening episode that we've done on Philippines 4.0. Up to now, the channel has really mostly been about building the house that you see behind me. But the house is nearly finished, so we're moving on to phase 2, which is dealing with the garden. We are in the tropics. It's hot. We're going to have a particular set of challenges here, but don't let the fact that we're talking about tropical gardening put you off. A lot of the things that we'll be trying to address will be issues that you'll face in gardens pretty much anywhere. Yes, we have a little bit more heat and a little bit more water than in some places, but generally speaking, we'll be covering gardening issues that affect everybody. So, the land. We have about 1.2 hectares of land. I'll give you a quick look around now. 3 acres if you prefer. And as you'll see, there's not an awful lot on it. We've got the house and we've got a couple of old small houses. We've got a greenhouse. Yes, a greenhouse in the tropics. We've got a fish pond. And because it's the Philippines, we've got a basketball court and an area for chickens. There's a lot that is unattended. Now, how are we going to deal with an area this size? One little bit at a time. And the starting point is going to be with that greenhouse. Well, actually, it goes back a step from that. It starts with making the compost to go into the greenhouse. One of the big problems we have here is the soil. It's absolutely rubbish. It's very compacted, it's very dry, quite dusty. Absolutely terrible for growing things. There's a few areas where the soil is a little better, but generally speaking, it's no good. So compost is going to be our growing medium for pretty much anything. Before we get to the compost, the greenhouse. This is it. So the idea is to try to get things inside there just a little bit cooler than they would be if they were out in the direct sun. The roof has a slightly translucent finish to it, which cuts out a tiny bit of the sun. We're then going to be covering the roof with shade cloth. We will, to begin with, be leaving the sides and ends open to allow good airflow. We'll see how that works. We may end up having to put cloth over the sides as well, but I don't want to do that because I don't want to stop beneficial insects getting in. So that's where we're going to be growing things, and we'll come to that in the next video. But let's get into compost. About the time that we started building our house, which was about 15 months ago, we started building these compost sheds. We knew we were going to need a lot of compost. It's a big area. So this was built pretty early on. It's 3 bays. Each bay is about 2 meters across, about 2.5 meters from back to front. And the pallet fronts are about 1.2 meters high, so we can go up roughly to that height, maybe a little bit above that. You'll see we've got a roof, and that's there really to try to stop a little bit of evaporation from direct sunlight, but also to keep water off, because when it rains here, boy does it rain. Tropical deluges. And if we let too much water get into that compost, it could become a bit of an anaerobic mess, which we don't want. So we want to moderate the amount of water. That is what our little experiment has been about. But hold your horses, I'm coming to it soon. So what is this science of compost? There's a paper published by the Cornell Waste Management Institute called Compost Chemistry. And it goes into quite a bit of detail. There's tons and tons and tons of material you can look at online. But what it fundamentally says is that the two key elements you need for what it terms microbial decomposition are carbon and nitrogen. And that's something you'll hear repeated on pretty much any YouTube video that you watch talking about composting. It then goes into quite a lot of detail about what is what in terms of carbon rich or nitrogen rich, and it comes up with the conclusion that really what you're looking for is a ratio of 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, and it helpfully adds by weight. But this is where it gets a bit tricky. So, to get to this magical 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, Cornell have listed a number of different elements that you typically find in a compost heap. And they've given you a range of the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So, as the first example, autumn leaves, between 30 and 80 to 1. Well, that's a pretty big range. Grass clippings, between 15 and 25 to 1. Well, smaller numbers, but as a percentage, that range is pretty enormous as well. Straw, between 40 and 100 to 1. Wood chips or sawdust, between 100 and 500 to 1. Can you see where this is going? You could carefully weigh out all of your ingredients, but you'd still have potentially a massive range in that carbon to nitrogen ratio, because each of the elements has a big range on its own. So that's the first issue. And the second issue, seriously, who weighs their compost? Well, maybe some people do. If you do, let me know. Does it help? Do you get better results? I'd love to know. But weighing compost elements seems like a step too far. Maybe a slightly easier way to look at this is the green and brown discussion. So, green, high in nitrogen, typically things like grass clippings, food waste, coffee grinds, animal manure. Brown, dried autumn leaves, twigs, bits of wood, paper, sawdust, all of those good things. So, if you look that up online, you'll see that you should have a ratio, a blend of those two things, and absolutely you should. But here's my problem. The first few papers I looked at said that ratio should either be 4 to 1, 2/3 to 1/3, or 1 to 1. Which one's right? I don't know. So, again, no real conclusion to that without some serious mathematics and delving much more into which ratio is correct. Here's the thing. Imagine for a moment the woodland. Big head honcho daddy or mummy tree. Does it call a meeting in late summer and ask all the animals to come and help out with a bit more poop? Because the tree and all of its family and friends are about to dump a load of leaves on the floor and they want a bit of a balance. No. The reality is, if you just dump any organic materials on the ground and leave them alone, they will decompose. You will have compost of some sort. So, I think, given how potentially tricky the maths and the science can be, I think you could ignore it. As long as, yes, it is beneficial if you do layer a little bit of green and brown, So, just in simple terms, what we've got behind me here is grass clippings, dried leaves, some chicken manure, some paper. In the very early stuff I did, there was a little bit of sawdust, but I stopped using that because I wasn't sure if that wood was being treated with anything, so didn't want that going in. But it's that simple. Just chuck it in layers and let it do its thing. There are two other massively important elements that are required, and I'll come to those next. In these two bays, this is our experiment, and it's to try and highlight how important the other elements are to the composting process. Believe it or not, these two bays have been filled as close as I could do it identically. I mean, I wasn't silly about it and weigh everything, but if I put a wheelbarrow full of leaves on one, I put the same on the other. If I put some coffee grinds in one, same on the other. Grass clippings, tried to do the same for both. So, these two lots, which are about 4 months old, have been treated absolutely identically, with one exception. They have been turned. In fact, I just finished turning it today, but only once. And the difference is water. The pile on the left has not had any water added to it. It has had to rely on whatever moisture was in the material that I put into that pile. The pile on the right has had water added moderately regularly. I've sprayed it pretty much every time I've added new components to the pile, and a few times in between. Let's have a bit of a closer look at what the result is at the end of those 4 months. So this is the unwatered compost. And you're probably going to be able to make out it really hasn't broken down very much. It still looks like what went into that pile. It is very dry. And I'm going to terminate the experiment now that I've turned it once, and I will be starting to water this as of tomorrow. But it's hardly broken down. And look at the difference in the height of these two bays. I'll swing the camera around in a moment, but before I do that, the temperature reading in here is about 28 degrees Celsius. Now let's compare that with the bay next to it. So this one, pretty much broken down. It is moist. There's still lots of slightly bigger bits in it, but the difference is incredible. And the temperature that we're getting, 50 degrees. Turned it yesterday, so that's bumped it up again a little bit, but totally different. The composting process is going on much faster. Now, that's not to say that if I never watered that other pile, we wouldn't end up with very good compost. We probably could, but it would just take a very, very much longer time. I've run out of patience with it, so yes, experiment finished. We're going to start watering it. We've said before, these bays are covered, so they do get very limited water getting in there unless I water it, but I can't leave it open. When the water comes, it'll just wash everything away. So that's the experiment. It shows how critically important water is to getting compost faster. Not necessarily better, although it might be. And the turning is just adding that air. The air goes in when you first add anything to your compost, and then just turning it. I've seen online you could do that every 3 weeks, but you see the size of these piles? I'm not doing that. And I wasn't in that much of a rush. So, turning it gets the air in. Here in the tropics in particular, where the evaporation is high, it needs water. You might not need to add water if you live in a more temperate climate. If you have no cover on your compost, you might get away with it. But just keep an eye on it. Everybody says it should have the consistency of a wrung out sponge. That's what you're aiming for. As any good chef might say, here's some I prepared earlier. This is actually 2 different lots of compost. The first lot is about a year old, and the second one is almost 15 months old now. So let's have a look at the end of 15 months, what we've ended up with. This is absolutely lovely jubbly. It just about holds together. It probably still needs a little bit more water, but then it crumbles. And I think that is probably pretty good stuff. And all that was made without the science. So, it's up to you. There's some great stuff out there about the science. If you want to follow that, I wouldn't discourage you at all. I'm just saying, it seems like a lot of hard work, and getting something very precise, given the ranges in the constituents, seems very difficult. So, my solution, kind of ignore it. Layer stuff, mix it up a bit, make sure there's water, turn it once, more if you like, and that's it. Let nature do its thing. You'll get compost. Next time, we're going to be showing you where the first application of this compost is going to be. And it's very close by. We've given you a sneak peek already. It's in that greenhouse. See you soon.